They stepped down from the truck beds, skin burned dark by the desert sun, hair matted with dust and sweat, eyes dimmed by exhaustion and fear. The canvas covering had offered little protection from the relentless North African heat, and even less from the weight of uncertainty that pressed down on their shoulders like invisible chains. Lucia Ferretti stood among them, her nurse's instincts still alert despite the fog of fatigue. She watched as the camp gate swung open, revealing rows of tents and wooden structures that shimmered in the afternoon glare. The other women pressed closer together, seeking comfort in proximity, their whispered Italian prayers barely audible over the idling engines. They had heard the stories: prisoners taken by the enemy, stripped of dignity, subjected to humiliation and worse. War had a way of turning humans into animals, and they had no reason to expect mercy from those they had once fought against. Lucia's hands, which had once moved with steady precision over wounded flesh, now trembled as she clutched the thin fabric of her dusty uniform. But then something unexpected happened. As the gates opened wider, a scent drifted toward them on the hot breeze. Not the metallic tang of blood or the acrid smell of gunpowder they had grown accustomed to. This was different. Clean. Almost impossibly clean. The faint aroma of soap mingled with warm steam that seemed to rise from somewhere within the camp. A tall American officer stepped forward, his uniform crisp despite the heat. His face was weathered, but his eyes were steady, calm. He gestured toward a long building with windows that reflected the late afternoon light. He pointed, made a motion of washing, of water flowing. Then he said something in English that most of them couldn't understand, but the universal gesture was clear. Showers. Hot water. Shampoo. The women exchanged glances, confusion mixing with disbelief. Lucia felt her breath catch in her throat. Hot water? Shampoo? Things they hadn't been allowed to touch in months. Things that belonged to a life before the war, before the blood and the screaming and the endless sand. At first, the fear won. This had to be a trap, some cruel form of psychological torture designed to break them before the real punishment began. Why would their captors offer them such kindness? In war, kindness was a currency that had lost all value, replaced by bullets and brutality and the raw mathematics of survival. But the American officer didn't move away. He simply stood there, patient, his hand still extended toward the building. Behind him, other soldiers carried stacks of clean towels, bottles with colorful labels, bars of soap wrapped in paper. Lucia noticed one woman in particular, standing near the front of the group. Her name was Rosa, and she had been a teacher before the war took that life away from her. Rosa's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, thick with fear and exhaustion. It's a trick, isn't it? They want to see us stripped bare, vulnerable. They want to humiliate us. But even as Rosa spoke those words, something in her eyes betrayed a desperate hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't completely lost its humanity. That somewhere in the machinery of war, there was still room for basic human decency. The American officer seemed to sense their hesitation. He stepped back, giving them space, and spoke again in English, his tone gentle, though most couldn't understand his words. They understood the tone. It carried no threat, no malice, just a simple invitation to wash away the grime of captivity. Slowly, hesitantly, the first woman stepped forward, then another. Then Lucia found her own feet moving, carrying her toward that building with its promise of hot water and soap, towards something that felt like a distant memory of civilization. As they crossed the threshold, the steam enveloped them completely. It was warm, almost uncomfortably so. After months of cold water, or no water at all, the smell of shampoo grew stronger, and in that moment, something inside Lucia's chest began to crack open. They had expected cruelty. They had prepared themselves for the worst that war could offer. But this unexpected tenderness in the middle of a desert prison camp, this was something none of them knew how to process. The water started to flow from the shower heads, and when it touched their sun-ravaged skin, when the warmth began to seep into their tired muscles, several women began to cry. Not from pain or fear, but from something far more complicated. Relief, gratitude, confusion. The overwhelming realization that the people they had been taught to see as enemies had just offered them back a piece of their humanity. Lucia stood under the stream, feeling each droplet wash away layers of dust and despair. She reached for the bottle of shampoo with shaking hands, squeezed out a portion that smelled impossibly clean. Like flowers she remembered from her grandmother's garden in Tuscany. As she worked it through her tangled hair, the scent transported her across thousands of miles and through the barriers of war, back to a time when the world made sense. In that moment, surrounded by steam and tears and the quiet sounds of women rediscovering what it meant to be clean, Lucia understood something profound. The war had tried to strip them of everything, to reduce them to nothing more than numbers and enemies and obstacles to be overcome. But this simple act, this offering of hot water and shampoo, was a declaration that they were still human beings worthy of basic dignity. Nobody could have predicted that this moment, suspended between the fear of captivity and the fragile hope of compassion, would become the turning point that redefined what humanity could mean even in the depths of war. That the scent of shampoo and the warmth of water would prove more powerful than all the propaganda and hatred that had brought them to this desert camp. The trucks had arrived in the late afternoon, their canvas coverings flapping in the wind that swept across the North African desert with relentless monotony. Sergeant Thomas Miller had watched their approach from the shade of the command tent, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that was already damp and stained with dust. He had been expecting them. The radio transmission had come through 2 days prior. Female prisoners of war, Italian medical personnel captured after the collapse of their field hospital near Tripoli. 23 women, ranging from nurses to clerks, now his responsibility under the provisions of the Geneva Convention. Miller was 37 years old, a career soldier who had seen action in the First World War when he was barely old enough to shave. He had come back from that war with scars both visible and hidden, with a profound understanding of what combat could do to the human soul. When this new war had called him back to service, he had answered, but he had promised himself one thing. He would not let it turn him into a monster. The women who climbed down from those trucks looked like refugees from some medieval painting of hell. Their uniforms were torn and filthy, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. Miller could see them trying to stand straight, to maintain some semblance of military bearing, but their bodies betrayed them. They swayed on their feet, barely able to remain upright after the long journey across rough desert roads. Lucia was among the last to disembark. She moved with the careful precision of someone conserving every last reserve of energy. Her dark hair, once probably tied back in a neat bun appropriate for a medical professional, now hung in tangled strands across her face. But her eyes were sharp, alert, taking in every detail of the camp, cataloging potential threats and opportunities for survival. Miller noticed her particularly because of those eyes. Despite everything, despite the obvious exhaustion and fear, she still looked at the world with a kind of fierce intelligence that demanded respect. She wasn't broken, not yet. And if Miller had anything to say about it, she wouldn't be broken at all during her time in his camp. The other guards moved forward to process the prisoners, checking names against manifests, assigning tent numbers, going through the mechanical routine of turning human beings into administrative categories. Miller watched, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. These women were now under his protection, and he took that duty seriously. As the processing continued, Miller observed the dynamics among the prisoners. They clustered in small groups, seeking comfort in familiar faces and shared language. Lucia seemed to be someone the others looked to, not for orders exactly, but for reassurance. She moved among them, touching shoulders, murmuring words in Italian that Miller couldn't understand, but whose intent was clear. We'll survive this. We'll get through it together. One woman in particular stayed close to Lucia. She was smaller, frailer looking, with red-rimmed eyes that suggested she had been crying recently. Miller would later learn her name was Rosa Martinelli, a schoolteacher from Milan who had volunteered for medical service when the war began. Rosa clung to Lucia's arm like a drowning person, holding onto driftwood. "They're going to kill us," Rosa whispered in Italian, not knowing that Miller had positioned himself close enough to hear. not knowing that he had learned enough Italian during his years stationed in Europe to catch the meaning, if not every word, or worse. "I've heard what happens to women prisoners." Lucia's response was firm, despite her own obvious fear. "We don't know that. We don't know anything yet. So we stay calm, we stay together, and we observe." Miller felt a surge of respect for this woman, who could maintain such composure under circumstances that would have broken many men he had served with. He made a mental note to ensure she received the same respect from his guards that her bearing demanded. The camp was not large by military standards. It had been established primarily to house prisoners awaiting transport to larger facilities in Algeria or Egypt, a temporary way station in the vast machinery of war. The structures were basic: rows of tents for sleeping, a communal latrine, a mess hall, and a few wooden buildings for administration and medical care. The entire compound was surrounded by barbed wire, more as a legal formality than a real deterrent in this landscape where escape would mean death by dehydration within days. As the women were led toward their assigned tents, Miller could feel the tension radiating from the group. They moved like people expecting ambush, their eyes darting to every shadow, every guard who passed by. The weight of their fear was almost palpable in the thick desert air. That evening, after the prisoners had been settled and fed a basic meal of bread and stew, Miller sat in his office reviewing the files that had accompanied them. Medical personnel, all of them. Lucia Ferretti, head nurse, age 32, 5 years of service with the Italian Army Medical Corps. Commendations for bravery, under fire. Multiple notations about her refusal to discriminate in treating casualties, providing care to Allied prisoners as readily as Italian soldiers. Miller stared at that last notation for a long time. A nurse who had treated enemy wounded with the same care as her own countrymen, in a war that seemed designed to strip away every shred of human decency. Here was evidence that some people still held onto their principles, even when it would have been easier, safer, to let them go. He closed the file and looked out his window toward the tents where the women prisoners were now trying to sleep. Through the canvas walls, he could hear the low murmur of conversation, the occasional sob quickly stifled. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out how to manage this unusual situation. Female prisoners were rare in this theater of war, and the camp had no facilities specifically designed for them. But more than logistics, Miller was thinking about something deeper. These women had been his enemies just days ago, serving an army that had allied itself with fascism, that had brought untold suffering to countless people. By all rights, he should feel nothing but contempt for them. And yet, looking at those files, reading about their service and their sacrifices, he found he couldn't summon that contempt. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also nurses who had saved lives, teachers who had educated children, women who had been swept up in forces far beyond their control. The question that kept Miller awake that night was simple but profound. How do you maintain your humanity when the world around you seems determined to destroy it? The next morning brought new challenges and old prejudices bubbling to the surface. Several of Miller's men had made their opinions clear over breakfast in the mess hall, their voices carrying across the hot morning air as Miller approached. "Don't see why we should waste resources on them," said Corporal Jenkins, a stocky man from Oklahoma whose brother had been killed by Italian artillery in Tunisia. "They're the enemy. Give them a tent and some rations and call it a day." Private Wilson, younger and less hardened, looked uncertain. "But they're women, Corp. And nurses, I heard. Doesn't seem right to treat them rough. They're soldiers." Jenkins shot back. "Wore the uniform, served the fascists. Gender doesn't change that." Miller understood Jenkins's anger. The man had every reason to hate anyone wearing an Italian uniform, but Miller also understood that hatred, left unchecked, had a way of consuming everything it touched, turning good men into something they would later be ashamed of. "They're prisoners of war," Miller said, his voice cutting through the conversation with quiet authority, "which means they fall under the protection of the Geneva Convention. We will treat them with the basic dignity that international law requires and that our own honor demands." Jenkins wanted to argue. Miller could see it in the set of his jaw. But military discipline won out, and the corporal simply nodded, though his eyes remained hard. Later that morning, Miller received the orders he had been expecting. A communication from headquarters, typed on official paper with all the proper seals and signatures, stating in bureaucratic language what Miller already knew. Prisoners of war would be treated in accordance with international law. They were to be provided with adequate food, shelter, medical care, and sanitation facilities. The memo specifically noted that female prisoners were to be housed separately and provided with appropriate accommodations for their needs. The last line was underlined: maintain standards of human dignity at all times. Miller read the order twice, then called for his logistics officer, Lieutenant Reeves, a methodical man from Connecticut who approached every problem like an engineering puzzle to be solved. We need to set up proper facilities for the female prisoners, Miller told him. Private showers, adequate supplies, everything by the book. Reeves raised an eyebrow. Showers? Sir, we barely have enough water for the regular troops. Then we requisition more. These women have been through hell. They're filthy, exhausted, and terrified. The least we can do is allow them to wash properly. Miller paused, then added, with hot water. And get some soap, shampoo, whatever the nurses in the medical tent use. Good quality stuff. Reeves looked at his commander with surprise, perhaps trying to determine if this was some kind of test. But Miller's expression was serious, brooking no argument. Sir, some of the men might not appreciate. That is, they might see it as favoritism, or, I don't give a damn what they might see it as, Miller said flatly. We're going to treat these prisoners like human beings, because that's what they are. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me personally. Over the next few hours, Miller watched as his orders were carried out. A section of one wooden building was converted into a bathing facility, partitioned off for privacy. Water tanks were filled and heating elements installed. Someone found cases of soap and shampoo from medical supplies, meant for the field hospital but repurposed for this new need. Clean towels were requisitioned from the quartermaster's stores. As the preparations continued, Miller found himself walking past the prisoner's tent. Through the open flap, he could see Lucia sitting with Rosa and several other women. They were talking in low voices, their body language tense and defensive. He caught fragments of conversation in Italian, words like trap and humiliation and dignity. They didn't trust this. Of course they didn't. In their position, Miller wouldn't trust it either. Promises from the enemy were worse than worthless. They were usually preludes to cruelty. The women had every reason to assume that any apparent kindness was just another form of psychological warfare, designed to lower their defenses before the real abuse began. Miller felt a sudden, urgent need to somehow communicate that this wasn't a trick, that his intentions were genuine. But how could he prove that? Words would be meaningless. Only actions would matter. And even then, trust would take time to build. That afternoon, when everything was ready, Miller personally went to the prisoner's tent. Lucia stood as he entered, her posture straight despite her obvious exhaustion. The other women rose as well, watching him with wary eyes. The bathing facilities are ready, Miller said in English, gesturing toward the wooden building. Hot water, soap, towels. Take your time. He knew most of them didn't understand his words, but Lucia's eyes showed recognition. She had at least some English, enough to catch the meaning. She translated for the others in rapid Italian, and Miller watched as disbelief spread across their faces. One woman laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. Another shook her head, clearly thinking this was impossible. Rosa gripped Lucia's arm tighter, her knuckles white with tension. It's not a trick, Miller said, looking directly at Lucia. You have my word. For a long moment, Lucia held his gaze. She was weighing him, judging his sincerity, trying to see beneath the uniform to the man underneath. Miller stood still, letting her look, hoping that somehow she could see that he meant what he said. Finally, Lucia nodded. She turned to the other women and spoke in Italian, her voice steady despite the tremor of uncertainty that ran beneath it. Whatever she said seemed to give them courage, or at least enough courage to take this leap of faith. They filed out of the tent slowly, a ragged procession of exhausted women moving toward the bathing building, with the hesitant steps of people who had forgotten what it meant to hope for something good. Miller walked ahead, showing them the way, acutely aware of how vulnerable they must feel, how every instinct must be screaming at them to run, to refuse, to protect themselves from whatever new horror this might turn out to be. He opened the door to the bathing facility and stepped aside. Inside, steam was already rising from the shower heads, which had been left running to warm up the space. The clean towels were stacked neatly on benches. Bottles of shampoo and bars of soap were arranged on wooden shelves. The women entered slowly, their eyes wide, with something that looked like shock. Lucia was among the last to enter. As she passed Miller, she paused, turned to look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was still suspicion there, still fear, but also a glimmer of something else, perhaps the first small seed of trust, or at least the willingness to consider the possibility that not all enemies were monsters. Miller nodded to her and backed away, closing the door to give them privacy. He stationed himself outside, not as a guard but as a protector, to ensure that none of his men disturbed them. He could hear water running, the echo of voices inside, and then, unmistakably, the sound of crying. Not the harsh sobs of despair, but something softer, more complex. The release of tension held too long, the overwhelming emotion of unexpected kindness, the simple human response to being treated with dignity after months of being reduced to nothing more than an enemy combatant. Standing outside that door, listening to those sounds, Sergeant Thomas Miller felt something shift inside himself. This war had taken so much from so many people. It had turned cities into rubble and men into killers. But here, in this small act of providing hot water and shampoo to frightened women, there was a chance to reclaim something essential, a reminder that even in the machinery of war, human beings could still choose compassion over cruelty, dignity over degradation. Inside the shower room, Lucia stood under the stream of hot water and felt years of accumulated tension begin to dissolve. The water was hot, almost too hot at first, but her body adjusted quickly, welcoming the warmth like a long-lost friend. She reached for the bottle of shampoo with trembling hands, squeezed out a portion that smelled clean and fresh, impossibly civilized in this harsh desert landscape. As she worked the shampoo through her matted hair, the scent surrounded her completely. It smelled like spring flowers, like her grandmother's garden in Tuscany, like the life she had lived before the war consumed everything. The simple act of washing her hair became almost unbearably poignant, a bridge connecting her to the person she had been before she learned what burned flesh smelled like, before she held dying men in her arms and felt their last breaths against her face. Around her, the other women were having their own moments of release. Rosa stood under a nearby showerhead with her eyes closed, tears mixing with the water that streamed down her face. Another woman, Francesca, was scrubbing her skin so vigorously that Lucia worried she might hurt herself, as if trying to wash away not just the dirt but the entire experience of captivity and war. "I can't believe this is real," Rosa whispered in Italian, her voice barely audible over the sound of running water. "Why would they do this for us?" Lucia didn't have an answer. She had seen too much of war to believe in simple goodness anymore. Every act had a motive. Every kindness came with a price. And yet, the water running over her body was undeniably real, the smell of shampoo undeniably clean. If this was manipulation, it was the strangest form she had ever encountered. "Maybe," Lucia said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "maybe not everyone has lost their humanity." It was a dangerous thought to entertain. Hope was a luxury they couldn't afford, a weakness that could be exploited. But standing under that warm water, feeling almost human again for the first time in months, Lucia found it impossible not to hope, just a little, that the world might be more complicated than the binary of friend and enemy that war demanded. When they finally emerged from the bathing facility, wrapped in clean towels, their hair damp and smelling of shampoo, the late afternoon sun felt different somehow. Gentler, perhaps, or maybe they were simply more able to appreciate it now that the layers of grime had been washed away. Sergeant Miller was still there, standing at a respectful distance. He had kept his word about privacy, about dignity. No guards had been posted at the door to leer or make crude comments. No one had disturbed them. For 30 minutes, they had been allowed to simply be human beings, taking care of their basic needs, nothing more complicated than that. As Lucia passed him, walking back toward the prisoner's tent with her head held higher than it had been in weeks, she made a decision. In careful, halting English, she said, "Thank you." Miller looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected gratitude. He nodded, his expression unreadable behind his military bearing. "You're welcome, ma'am. Ma'am. Not prisoner. Not enemy. Not even just woman. Ma'am, a term of respect that acknowledged her humanity and dignity." Lucia felt something crack a little more inside her chest, some defensive wall she had built around her heart beginning to crumble. That night, in the tent she shared with the other prisoners, the atmosphere was different. The women talked more freely, their voices carrying a note of cautious optimism that hadn't been there before. They touched their clean hair, marveling at the simple pleasure of feeling fresh, of smelling like soap instead of sweat and fear. My grandmother used to say, Rosa spoke into the darkness, that you can tell a person's character by how they treat those who are completely at their mercy. No one responded immediately, but Lucia knew they were all thinking the same thing. The Americans had them completely at their mercy. By all the rules of war and power, they could have done anything. But instead, they had offered hot water and shampoo. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt monumental. A gesture that spoke volumes about what kind of men they were dealing with. "We're still prisoners," Francesca said, ever the pragmatist. "Clean prisoners, but prisoners nonetheless." "Yes," Lucia agreed. "But maybe being a prisoner doesn't have to mean losing everything that makes us human." Outside the tent, the desert night was cold, the stars brilliant in the clear sky. Somewhere in the distance, a guard called out the hourly watch report. The war continued, indifferent to these small moments of humanity that flowered in its shadow. But inside that tent, 23 women slept more soundly than they had in months, their hair clean, their bodies free of accumulated filth, their spirits cautiously daring to believe that survival might not require the complete surrender of dignity. And in his office, Sergeant Thomas Miller sat awake, thinking about the woman who had thanked him in halting English, wondering why she seemed so familiar, trying to remember where he might have seen those steady, intelligent eyes before. The sound of American soldiers' voices rose in anger from the other side of the camp. Lucia, who had been hanging clean laundry in the weak morning sun, paused to listen. She couldn't understand most of the English, but the tone was unmistakable. Objection, resentment, the kind of anger that simmers just below the surface, waiting for an excuse to boil over. "Soft-hearted officer," she heard distinctly, the words clear enough for her limited English to catch. Then more she couldn't decipher. But the contempt in the voices needed no translation. She felt her stomach tighten with familiar guilt. Of course, some of the soldiers would resent the treatment the prisoners received. They had lost brothers, friends, comrades to Italian bullets and artillery. Why should they be expected to show kindness to the enemy? What right did she and the other prisoners have to expect anything beyond bare survival? Rosa approached, carrying an armful of clothes they had been allowed to wash. "What's happening?" "They're angry," Lucia said quietly. "About us. About how the sergeant treats us. Should we say something? Tell them we don't need. That we don't expect." "No." Lucia cut her off gently. "It would only make it worse. We stay quiet. We stay grateful, and we try not to cause any trouble." But the guilt gnawed at her through the rest of the day. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Lucia found herself standing near the fence, looking out at the vast emptiness beyond. The heat was finally breaking, giving way to the cold that would grip the desert through the night. Her mind drifted to the past, to a night that felt like a lifetime ago but was only 9 months previous. A field hospital in the hills north of Naples, shells falling close enough to shake dust from the ceiling, wounded men crying out in pain from every corner of the converted barn. She had been working on an Italian soldier, a boy really, barely 20 with a stomach wound that was beyond her ability to save. She held his hand and lied to him, told him he would be fine, that he would see his mother again. The lies came easier than the truth. Someone had called out that there were wounded outside, captured enemy soldiers who had been left by their retreating unit. The other nurses had looked at each other with exhaustion and a kind of grim calculation. They were overwhelmed already. Italian boys were dying for lack of supplies and time. Why should they spend their limited resources on the enemy? But Lucia had looked up from the dying boy whose hand she held and said, "Bring them in." There had been 3 Americans. One was already dead, beyond anyone's help. The second had a shattered leg that she amputated with a saw and a prayer, hoping the tourniquet would hold long enough for him to reach a proper surgical facility. The third had been a sergeant, his abdomen torn open by shrapnel, his life bleeding out onto the barn floor. She remembered his face now, remembered how his eyes had focused on her as she worked, how he had tried to speak but couldn't through the pain. She had operated on him for 3 hours, her hands steady even as the building shook from nearby explosions, extracting metal fragments piece by piece, suturing damaged organs with thread that was meant for canvas tents because they had run out of proper surgical supplies. He had lived. She had received a report 2 days later that the American prisoners had been successfully evacuated and were expected to survive. The boy she had been holding when they arrived, the Italian boy with the stomach wound, had died while she was saving the enemy sergeant. She had never told anyone about the guilt she felt over that, how she wondered if she had made the right choice, how she questioned whether her oath to save lives, regardless of nationality, was noble or simply naive. War forced impossible choices, and there was no way to know if the decisions you made were right or wrong, only that you had to live with them afterward. "Ma'am?" A voice behind her made Lucia turn. It was one of the American guards, young Private Wilson, the one who had defended them in the mess hall that first morning. "The sergeant wants to see you." In his office, Lucia's heart began to race. Had she done something wrong? Was this when the other shoe dropped? When the pretense of civility ended, and the real nature of captivity revealed itself? She followed Private Wilson across the camp, acutely aware of the stares from other soldiers. Some looked merely curious. Others, like Corporal Jenkins, glared with open hostility. She kept her eyes forward, her posture straight, trying to maintain dignity even as fear clawed at her insides. Miller's office was small and functional, furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet that looked like it had survived several wars. He stood as she entered, a gesture of respect that surprised her. "Please, sit," he said in English, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Lucia sat, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for whatever was coming. Miller studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Do you speak English?" he asked carefully. "A little," Lucia replied. I learned. Before war." Miller nodded. He seemed to be wrestling with something, searching for words. "Finally," he said. "November 1943. Field Hospital. North of Naples." Lucia felt her breath catch. Her mind raced, trying to understand how he could know about that specific night. "There was a sergeant," Miller continued. "American. Shrapnel wound to the abdomen. You operated on him. Saved his life." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Lucia stared at this man across the desk, this American sergeant who had shown her and her fellow prisoners unexpected kindness. And suddenly she saw past the desert tan, past the weathered lines and the military bearing, to the face of the man she had held together with stitches and determination 9 months ago. "That was you," she whispered, the words coming out in Italian before she could stop them. "Dio mio, that was you." Miller nodded slowly. "I didn't recognize you at first. You looked different then. Cleaner." He smiled slightly at his own dark humor. "But yesterday, when you thanked me in English, something about your voice, your eyes, it came back to me, and I checked your records." Lucia Ferretti, head nurse, stationed at the field hospital near Naples in November 43. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of this revelation settling over both of them. The boundaries that war had drawn between them suddenly seemed absurd, meaningless. She had saved his life when he was her enemy. Now he was returning that humanity when she was his prisoner. I thought about that night a lot, Miller said quietly. You could have let me die. You were overwhelmed, low on supplies. I was the enemy, but you didn't. You worked on me like I was one of your own soldiers. You saved my life when you had every reason not to. It was my duty, Lucia said, finding her English words carefully. As nurse, as human. Duty, Miller repeated. Is that all it was? Lucia thought about the question. No, she admitted. It was more. It was choice. To choose to see person, not enemy. To choose humanity over hate. That's why I ordered the showers, Miller said. The hot water, the soap, the dignity, because you reminded me, that night in Naples, that we're all just people caught up in something bigger than ourselves. That the uniforms we wear don't change what we are underneath. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small object wrapped in brown paper. He pushed it across the desk to her. What is this? Lucia asked. Open it. She unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside was a small mirror, the kind a soldier might carry in his field kit. The glass was cracked in one corner, but it was still functional. On the back, someone had engraved words in Italian. Con riconoscenza, with gratitude. I've been carrying that since Naples, Miller said. Waiting for a chance to give it to the nurse who saved me. Looks like fate finally gave me that chance. Even if it happened in the strangest possible way. Lucia held the mirror, her vision blurring with tears. This small object, this acknowledgement that her choice to save him had mattered, that it had been seen and valued, felt more precious than anything she owned. We were soldiers, she said softly, the English words coming more easily now. But we are still humans. Yes, Miller agreed. And if we can remember that, maybe we can get through this war without losing everything that makes us worth saving. The conversation that followed was brief but profound. They spoke about the war, about the impossibility of maintaining humanity in the face of so much death, about the choices they had both made, and the weight of those choices. They talked about home, about the lives they hoped to return to when this was all over, about whether the world they knew before would still exist when the guns finally fell silent. When Lucia left Miller's office an hour later, she walked with her head high, the small mirror tucked safely in her pocket. The other prisoners noticed the change in her immediately. The fear that had shadowed her eyes since their arrival was still there, but it was joined now by something else. Understanding, connection, the knowledge that even in war, even in captivity, humanity could still find ways to bridge the chasms that divided people. That night, she told the other women what she had learned, about the American sergeant she had saved, about the recognition, about the mirror that carried words of gratitude across 9 months and half a continent. As she spoke, she saw something shift in their expressions, a softening of the defensive walls they had built around their hearts. Maybe, Rosa said thoughtfully, maybe this is what the world looks like when people choose to remember each other's humanity. Or maybe, Francesca added, ever practical, maybe we just got lucky with who captured us. Both things could be true, Lucia thought. Luck and choice, fate and decision, all tangled together in the complex web of human interaction that war tried so hard to simplify into binary categories of friend and enemy, good and evil. Outside, the desert night wrapped around the camp like a blanket. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human conflicts and human compassion alike. But inside that tent, 23 women allowed themselves to believe, just a little more, that survival didn't have to mean the surrender of everything that made life worth living. The days that followed brought subtle but significant changes to the camp. Sergeant Miller, emboldened by his conversation with Lucia and perhaps by the simple acknowledgement of their shared history, began to implement new policies that transformed the nature of the prisoners' captivity. The daily routines expanded beyond mere survival. A small section of the library tent was designated for the female prisoners, stocked with books in Italian that had been requisitioned from larger camps or confiscated from captured supply depots. Someone found an old gramophone and a collection of records, including several Italian opera recordings that made the women weep with homesickness and joy in equal measure. The food improved, not dramatically, but noticeably. Fresh vegetables appeared more regularly, and the portions increased. Miller argued with the quartermaster over every additional ration. But he argued persistently, citing regulations and international law and simple human decency until he wore the man down. Most significantly, Miller began allowing the Italian nurses to assist in the camp's medical facility. It started small, with Lucia helping to inventory supplies and organize the medicine cabinet. But soon the camp's overworked American medics were consulting with her on difficult cases, recognizing that her experience and skill transcended national boundaries. Rosa, with her background as a teacher, was allowed to conduct informal classes for some of the younger prisoners who wanted to improve their English. The classes became popular with some of the American soldiers, too, who were curious about Italian language and culture. These small gatherings, where soldiers and prisoners mixed freely within carefully maintained boundaries of propriety, became islands of normalcy in the sea of war. Not everyone approved of these changes. Corporal Jenkins and a handful of other soldiers watched the developing camaraderie with dark suspicion, muttering about traitors and sympathizers. One evening, a group of them confronted Miller directly as he walked between tents. "This ain't right, Sergeant," Jenkins said, his Oklahoma drawl thick with disapproval. "These people killed Americans. They don't deserve to be treated like guests at a hotel." Miller stopped, turned to face the group. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried an edge of steel. "These people are prisoners of war under the protection of international law. We will treat them accordingly. Laws didn't stop them from—" "I don't care," Miller cut him off. "I don't care what they did or didn't do before they became our prisoners. What I care about is what we do now, because that's what we'll have to live with when this war is over. That's what we'll see in the mirror for the rest of our lives." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You think I don't know what the Italians did? You think I don't remember every American who died because of them? But here's the thing, Corporal. We don't honor those deaths by becoming the kind of men who abuse prisoners. We honor them by being better, by proving that we fight for something worth preserving." Jenkins wanted to argue. Miller could see it in his face, in the set of his shoulders. But the sergeant's words had struck something deeper than anger, had touched on the complicated truth that all of them carried, that war demanded they become something less than human, but their survival as individuals depended on resisting that demand. The tension broke slowly. Jenkins nodded, the gesture grudging but real. "Yes, sir." As the men dispersed, Miller felt the weight of leadership settle more heavily on his shoulders. He was walking a fine line, trying to maintain discipline while advocating for compassion, trying to hold together a military unit while allowing space for humanity. It was exhausting, and he knew that one wrong step could undermine everything he was trying to build. But then he would see Lucia in the medical tent, her hands moving with confident precision as she sutured a wound or changed a dressing. And he would remember why this mattered. She had chosen to see him as a human being when he was her enemy. The least he could do was return that choice. One afternoon, as Lucia worked in the medical tent treating a soldier's infected foot, she heard singing from outside. The voices were Italian, multiple women harmonizing on a song that she recognized from her childhood. Bella Ciao, the partisan song that had become an anthem of resistance and hope. She paused in her work, listening to the voices rise and fall. The soldier whose foot she was treating looked uncomfortable, unsure how to react to enemy soldiers singing what was essentially a war song within the confines of an American camp. "It's about freedom," Lucia explained in her careful English, seeing his discomfort. "About fighting for what is right, about hoping for a better world." The soldier thought about this. "My grandmother was Italian," he said finally, "from Sicily. She used to sing songs like that when I was little." "Then you understand," Lucia said. "Music is, how do you say, universal?" "Universal," the soldier confirmed. "Yeah, I guess it is." Later that day, Miller found Lucia standing near the fence again, looking out at the desert. The sun was setting, turning the sky into a riot of colors that seemed too beautiful for a world at war. "They're talking about transferring you all to a larger camp," Miller said without preamble. "In Algeria. Within the month. Probably." Lucia absorbed this news silently. Part of her was relieved. A larger camp would mean more resources, possibly better conditions, maybe even news about when the war might end and when she might go home. But another part felt something like sadness at the thought of leaving this place where, against all odds, she had found unexpected humanity. "You have given us more than duty required," she said. I think you give us hope," Miller smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "You gave me hope first. Back in Naples, when you chose to save an enemy's life, you reminded me that there was still something worth fighting for beyond just victory." "What happens after war?" Lucia asked. "Do we become enemies again?" "I don't know," Miller admitted. "But I hope not. I hope we remember these moments, these choices we made, to see each other as humans first, and soldiers second. I hope that means something when the shooting stops." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun disappear below the horizon. In the growing darkness, the camp lights began to flicker on, small circles of illumination against the vast emptiness of the desert night. "There's a package on your bunk," Miller said as he turned to leave. "A gift from the men in the medical corps." Lucia found the package that evening, wrapped carefully in brown paper. Inside was a bottle of shampoo, the same kind she had used that first day when the world had shifted on its axis. With it was a note, written in several different hands, signed by all the medics who had worked alongside her. "For your next shower in freedom. Thank you for reminding us what it means to be healers." She held the bottle and the note and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming complexity of gratitude and hope and loss all tangled together. Around her, the other women gathered close, reading the note over her shoulder, marveling at this evidence that enemies could become something more when they chose to see each other clearly. That night, as the camp settled into sleep, Lucia lay in her bunk and thought about the impossible journey that had brought her here. From the hills of Tuscany to the battlefields of North Africa, from treating wounded soldiers in a bombed-out barn to being treated with dignity as a prisoner of war. The path had been twisted and painful and marked by loss at every turn. But there had been moments of light, too. Moments like the one in Naples when she chose to save a dying man regardless of his uniform. Moments like the first shower in this camp, when hot water and shampoo had seemed like miracles. Moments like tonight, holding a bottle of shampoo and a note that proved kindness could survive even in the machinery of war. The future remained uncertain. The war ground on, consuming lives and resources and hope with indifferent efficiency. But Lucia had learned something crucial in these weeks of captivity. That human dignity was not something that could be permanently taken away, only temporarily obscured. That compassion was a choice available even in the darkest circumstances. That the simple act of treating someone with respect could echo far beyond its moment, creating ripples that might eventually help heal the wounds that war inflicted. She drifted toward sleep with the bottle of shampoo clutched in her hands, a talisman against despair, a promise that freedom would come and that, when it did, she would carry these lessons with her. That she would remember the American sergeant who repaid a life debt with dignity, who proved that enemies could become something more complicated and more hopeful than war allowed for. In his office, Sergeant Thomas Miller sat at his desk, writing a letter he would never send. It was addressed to no one in particular, just his thoughts committed to paper. A way of processing the strange situation he found himself in. "I've learned something here in the desert," he wrote. "I've learned that humanity is not a finite resource that we must hoard and protect from our enemies. It is, instead, something that grows when shared, that multiplies when given freely, that becomes stronger when extended even to those we're supposed to hate." He paused, pen hovering over paper. "The war will end someday. I'll go home, back to whatever remains of the life I left behind, and I'll carry this time with me. These weeks when I had the chance to repay a life debt not just to one woman but to all the women under my care. When I chose, day after day, to see prisoners not as enemies but as human beings deserving of basic dignity." He finished the letter and tucked it into his journal, another entry in the long record of his war. Outside, the desert night was cold and clear, the stars brilliant overhead, unchanged by human conflicts and human compassions alike. But inside the camp, in the small spaces between duty and discretion, something was changing. A story was being written that would outlast the war, that would be remembered long after the battles were forgotten. A story about hot showers and shampoo, about the choice to preserve dignity even in captivity, about the stubborn persistence of humanity, even in the face of forces designed to destroy it. The weeks passed with surprising speed. The routines of camp life became familiar, almost comfortable. The Italian prisoners integrated more fully into the daily operations, their skills utilized, their humanity acknowledged. The initial hostility from some of the American soldiers softened, not entirely but noticeably, as familiarity replaced abstraction. Then, on a morning that seemed like any other, the announcement came. The war in North Africa was over. The Axis forces had surrendered, and soon, very soon, the prisoners would be processed for return to Italy. The news sparked a complex mixture of emotions in the camp. Relief that the fighting had ended, at least in this theater. Uncertainty about what came next. About what they would find when they returned home. About how a defeated nation would rebuild itself. For Lucia and the other women, it meant the end of their captivity. The beginning of whatever came next. They would be transferred to a processing center, given new papers, eventually put on ships that would carry them back across the Mediterranean to whatever remained of their homeland. On the last evening before the transfer, Miller called Lucia to his office one final time. She came, as always, with her quiet dignity intact despite everything she had been through. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," Miller said. "To thank you, again, for what you did in Naples. And to give you this." He handed her a small package. Inside was a bottle of shampoo, identical to the one the medics had given her, and a handwritten note. "For your next shower," the note read, "in freedom. May you find peace, and may the world be kinder to you than war has been." Lucia held the bottle and the note, her vision blurring. "I will never forget," she said, "what you do here, how you choose to see us as humans, not just enemies. This will stay with me always." "I hope it stays with all of us," Miller replied. "I hope we remember that the choice to be human, to be compassionate, that's a choice we can make even in impossible circumstances, especially in impossible circumstances." They shook hands, a gesture that transcended nationality and military rank, a simple acknowledgement of shared humanity. Then Lucia left his office for the last time, walking back to the tent where the other women were preparing for departure. That night, the Italian women sang one last time. Not Bella Ciao with its themes of resistance and defiance, but older songs, folk songs about home and family and the simple joys of life beyond war. The American soldiers listened from their tents, and some found themselves humming along to melodies that needed no translation. The next morning, the trucks arrived to transport the prisoners to the processing center. As the women climbed aboard, Lucia looked back one last time at the camp that had been both prison and sanctuary, hell and haven, depending on the moment. She saw Sergeant Miller standing near his office, watching them depart. He raised his hand in a simple wave, and she returned it, knowing that this moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. That decades from now, when the war was a distant memory and the world had moved on to new conflicts and new crises, she would still remember the American sergeant who chose compassion over cruelty, who repaid a life debt with dignity. The trucks pulled away, raising clouds of dust that obscured the camp behind them. The women fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. But Lucia clutched the bottle of shampoo in her hands, a tangible reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could survive. That kindness was not weakness, but strength. That the simple act of treating someone with dignity could echo across years and borders and the vast distances that war tried to impose between human hearts. 20 years later, in a small apartment in Florence, an older woman sat by a window with her granddaughter. The afternoon sun streamed through the glass, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. "Tell me the story again, Nonna," the girl said. About the war. Lucia, now in her 50s, her hair gray but her eyes still sharp, smiled. On the windowsill beside her was an old bottle of shampoo, nearly empty but carefully preserved. Which story do you want to hear, Bambina? The one about the shower. About the American soldiers. Lucia nodded slowly. She had told this story many times over the years, to anyone who would listen, not because it was extraordinary in the grand scheme of the war, but because it was extraordinary in its ordinariness, because it proved that even in hell, small acts of heaven were possible. We were prisoners, she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a well-practiced tale. Dirty, exhausted, expecting the worst that humans could do to each other. But when the gates opened, we didn't find cruelty. We found something much more powerful. We found compassion. She picked up the bottle of shampoo, held it up to the light so it glowed amber in the sunday. This bottle was a gift. It reminded me that being human is a choice we make every day, in every interaction. That treating someone with dignity costs nothing but means everything. Was the American sergeant a good man, Nana? Lucia thought about the question. He was a man who chose to be good, even when it would have been easier to be cruel. That's more important, I think. Anyone can be good when it costs them nothing. But Sergeant Miller chose humanity when it was difficult. When some of his men criticized him for it. When hatred would have been so much simpler. She looked out the window at the streets of Florence, at the city that had been rebuilt after the war, at the life that had continued despite everything. The world tries to make us forget our humanity. War, hatred, fear. They all want us to see each other as categories instead of individuals. But that day, in that shower, with hot water and shampoo that smelled like flowers, I remembered that I was still human, still worthy of dignity, still connected to every other person on this planet by threads stronger than nationality or ideology. Do you ever think about him? The granddaughter asked. The American? All the time, Lucia admitted. I wonder if he made it through the rest of the war. I wonder if he went home, if he found peace, if he remembered those weeks in the desert camp the way I do. What she didn't tell her granddaughter was about the letters. How she had tried, after the war, to find Sergeant Thomas Miller. How she had written to the American military, to veterans organizations, to anyone who might be able to help her track down the man who had returned her humanity when she had thought it lost forever. The responses had been frustrating. Records were incomplete. Many soldiers had returned home and wanted nothing more than to forget the war. Addresses changed, and people moved on. She never found him, never knew if he survived or what became of him after North Africa. But in her drawer, carefully preserved alongside important documents and treasured photographs, was a single letter. It had arrived 15 years after the war ended, forwarded through several military channels before finding its way to her in Florence. The envelope was yellowed with age and handling, but the words inside were clear, written in a steady hand. Dear Nurse Ferretti, I hope this letter finds you well and living in the peace you deserve. I've thought often of our time in the desert, of the strange circumstances that brought us together twice in the chaos of war. I wanted you to know that those weeks changed me. They reminded me why we fight, what we fight for, not just territory or ideology, but for the preservation of our fundamental humanity. I made it through the war. I'm home now in Kansas, working as a school teacher, trying to give young people some understanding of the world beyond their small town. I tell them stories sometimes, about the war, about the lessons I learned. I tell them about an Italian nurse who saved my life when she had every reason to let me die, about female prisoners who sang opera in a desert camp, about the transformative power of hot water and dignity freely given. Thank you for saving my life in Naples, but thank you more for saving something deeper than that. You saved my belief that humans can be better than our worst moments, that compassion is not weakness, that the choice to see another person's humanity is the most important choice we ever make. I've kept the memory of those weeks with me like a talisman against cynicism. When the world seems dark, when people disappoint, when the news is full of hatred and division, I remember a tent in the desert where former enemies chose to be human together. I hope you found your way home. I hope your life has been good. I hope you know that your choice to be compassionate, to be human, echoes far beyond the moments when you made it. With deep gratitude and respect, Thomas Miller. Lucia had read that letter 100 times, maybe more. She had cried over it, smiled over it, drawn strength from it in difficult moments. It was proof that those weeks in the desert had mattered, that small acts of humanity could ripple out across decades and distance. Now, sitting with her granddaughter in the late afternoon light, Lucia felt the weight of memory settle over her like a familiar blanket. The war had taken so much from so many people, but it had also, in its strange way, revealed fundamental truths about human nature. That cruelty was easy, but compassion was powerful. That hatred came naturally, but love had to be chosen, again and again. In small moments that accumulated into lives and legacies. Remember this, Bambina, she said to her granddaughter. The world will test you. It will try to make you hard, cynical, willing to see others as less than human. But you must resist. You must choose, every day, to see the humanity in every person you meet. Because that choice, that simple choice, is what separates us from the darkness. The granddaughter nodded solemnly, not fully understanding but sensing the importance of her grandmother's words. Someday, when she was older, when the world had tested her, and she had faced her own moral choices, she would remember this moment. She would remember the old bottle of shampoo on the windowsill, the story of hot water in a desert camp, the lesson that dignity freely given could echo across generations. As the sun moved lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Florence, Lucia closed her eyes and remembered. The heat of the desert, the smell of soap and shampoo, the feeling of warm water washing away not just dirt but despair. The moment when enemies became something more complicated and more human than war allowed for. She remembered Sergeant Miller's face as he handed her that first bottle of shampoo, the note that came with it, the words that had sustained her through decades. For your next shower in freedom. She had taken many showers since then, in freedom and in peace. But none had ever felt quite as transformative as that first one, when hot water and human kindness had combined to remind her that she was still alive, still human, still connected to the great web of human experience that transcended nationality and ideology and war. The bottle on the windowsill caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing like amber, like a small beacon of hope preserved across the years. It was nearly empty now, just a few drops left of the shampoo that had once smelled like flowers and freedom. But Lucia had never been able to throw it away. It was more than a bottle, more than a container for soap. It was a symbol of everything humans could be when they chose compassion over cruelty, dignity over degradation, humanity over hatred. As darkness fell over Florence, as the city lights began to flicker on across the ancient streets, Lucia sat by her window and remembered. And in remembering, she kept alive the story of a moment when the world, for just a little while, had been better than it had any right to be. When hot water and shampoo had become instruments of healing, when enemies had chosen to see each other as humans, when small acts of kindness had echoed across decades like prayers or promises. She would tell this story as long as she lived, would pass it down to her granddaughter and to anyone else who would listen. Because stories like this needed to be remembered, needed to be told and retold until they became part of the collective memory of what humans could be at their best. The war was over. The soldiers had gone home. The camps had been dismantled and forgotten. But the choices made in those camps, the humanity preserved in the face of forces designed to destroy it, those things endured. They endured in bottles of shampoo kept on windowsills, in letters carefully preserved in drawers, in stories told to granddaughters on quiet afternoons. They endured in the memory of what it meant to be human, and in the eternal hope that humans, given the choice, would choose compassion over cruelty, dignity over degradation, love over hatred, again and again and again, in small moments that accumulated into something larger than any individual life, into the collective story of a species still learning, still striving, still hoping to be better than its worst moments. And so the story lived on, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from memory to hope, from past to future, a small light against the darkness, a reminder that even in war, even in captivity, even in the depths of despair, the human spirit could still choose kindness, could still choose to see the humanity in every face, friend or enemy, and in seeing it, preserve it for generations yet to come.